that Bernard wrote where he basically looked at every aspect of Christ from his head down to his feet and wrote a poem just talking about the love that was shown on the cross. Did anyone read the excerpt on Loving God by Bernard of Clairvaux? Oh, good. Any thoughts on that, comments on that? I mean, it was a short excerpt, but anybody got any thoughts? Was it good? Could you understand what he was saying? What's his main point? Anybody that read it? Okay, enjoy God. Okay, yeah. I like what he says. True love is its own satisfaction. It has its reward, but that reward is the object loved. For whatever you seem to love, if it is on account of something else, what you do really love is that something else, not the apparent object of desire. If I love God because I expect God to bless me with good health, then what I really love is good health. And God is a means to me to get that. If I'm loving God because I'm assuming He's going to give me wealth and a blessed life, then what I really love is wealth and a blessed life, and God is a means to that end. And so if you think about it, the reward to love is the person that you love. And so the reward in loving God is God Himself, and God can give us nothing more than Himself. And so I love God because God is the satisfaction to my soul. And the fact that I struggle to believe that or love Him for some other reason says I haven't really understood how much my heart is longing for God and Him alone. I like what he says. He basically says that our hearts are made to feed on God, He's our satisfaction. And to try to find satisfaction in something else is like a man who's trying to fill his stomach by gulping air. And he says if you were to go outside and see a man who is trying to feed himself by sucking air, you'd think the man's gone crazy. But he says that's what we're trying to do when we're trying to use riches or success or other things in the world to feed our soul. It's like trying to fill your stomach with air. It just isn't going to work. Any other thoughts on that? Or good excerpt. Yes, Monica. Yeah. Yeah. But you love them because they're your child. Yep. Amen. And again, I gave you this excerpt because when you look at, again, most people who know church history from Protestant standpoint, we only know 1517 till today. Because we don't know what to do with a lot between Constantine and Luther. Because when you look at Bernard of Clairvaux's life, you sometimes think there's some things that are just said that are really good, and then if you go further and you research and you read some of his other stuff, you think, yeah, I'm not sure I like that. That's the confusion, the challenge. But if you look at what he says, he understands that when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God, and that God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. And he understands, even in O Sacred Head Now Wounded, you died in my place. He understood that. Unfortunately, there's some other stuff he wrote that you think it's just confusing. But again, you have to understand that you have to look at them in their own context and their own time. And in the end, God is the one that knows the heart. But I sort of go with Martin Luther. Martin Luther basically said no one loved God or no one loved Jesus as much as Bernard did. And I think he did have a love for Him. So let's just go over this real quick. I sort of want to review. Before we do, if you go back to that timeline or not, I just want to throw these dates up there because if nothing else, start getting in your mind what's happening. What happened in 64 AD? This is Group quiz. Yeah. Great Fire of Rome, that's really, up until that time, Jews are the ones persecuting Christians. At 64, suddenly now Romans have turned their attention and are persecuting Christians. What happens in AD 70? Destruction of Jerusalem. Now Christianity is fully exposed. Many people saw Christianity as just a sect of Judaism, but now once Judaism, Jerusalem is destroyed, now Christianity is fully persecuted as a religion. What happens in 313? Edict of Milan. Now you're going to start having Christianity be recognized as Constantine favors Christianity. What happens in 410? Fall of Rome. And so now what you're going to see is things begin to change as Rome falls and the church fills the power vacuum. 622? Muhammad, yeah, and that's going to have impact even till today. That's when he flees Medina. People consider that the first year of Islam. 800, Pope Leo crowns Charlemagne. It's the beginning of what's called the Holy Roman Empire. 1054, Great Schism, East and West split. I'm obviously following the western side of that, and that's why I'm emphasizing more on the western side, but the church developed. You had a Greek-speaking side and you had a Latin-speaking side, and they sort of developed together. That's why Orthodoxy and Catholicism share a lot of the same attributes. They do have a few differences. One of the biggest is, on the western side, there's only one bishop on the western side, the Bishop of Rome, and so he is elevated to the supreme bishop. On the eastern side, you had the bishops of Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, and they formed more of a patriarchy. And so on the Orthodox side, you don't have a supreme bishop. You have a leader of different church fathers, and so that's one of the big splits that happens in 1054. Anybody know what's happened in 1095? The start of the Crusades, which we'll look at tonight. So again, just some of those periods: age of persecution there until 313, age of prosperity when the Roman Empire is giving its income and its riches to the church. And then after Rome falls, you could probably call it the age of power. Again, if you could illustrate it, you'd basically say the state was crushing the church there in the age of persecution. Age of prosperity, church and state were melded together. Age of power, the church begins to dominate the state. And so it's interesting how that took place and the impact it had when the church fills that power vacuum. Okay, Bernard of Clairvaux, we looked at him last week. He recovered. Many people look at him as recapturing the gospel. If you remember that period of time from about 800 to 1000, I read all about the papal decadence. That's history. It was a terrible time when there were groups vying for the power of the papacy. And you had the cadaver synod where Stephen VI dug up his predecessor and tried his corpse. I mean, it's just gross stuff. Well, Bernard is part of this reforming spirit that's trying to recapture the heart of the gospel. His love for God impacted later reformers. Luther and Calvin are going to draw a lot from his writings. His love for God still touches us today. He was born in Dijon, the home of mustard, so there in France. Anyway, again, this is just review from what we covered quickly last week. Why would anyone join a monastery? It doesn't make sense to us, but back then it was a way of self-denial, a way of simplicity, a way of service, a way of stability. If the whole world has gone chaotic, to go into a place where there is stability and structure to what you're doing, it appealed to a lot of people, and it was the place that people felt like they could get close to God, and sometimes when the church had become very corrupt. I love this. This is one of my favorite things in all of the ancient writings. Is he talked about this progression that the unbeliever loves self for self's sake. It's all about me. When we come to Christ, very often, though, we love God for self's sake. I'm coming to God because I want eternal life, or I want him to heal my family or something like that. But then you get to a place where you love God for God's sake, and you just love him because he is God and he's worthy of our worship. And I liked his fourth stage. I think it sort of can keep someone from going to an ascetic extreme. He said, fourth stage is love of self for God's sake. When I understand who I am, but it does not become a selfishness, but I understand my identity, and it's for his glory because I see what he has done. And that's really what Ephesians 1 is telling us, all the things that we are because we're in Christ. And so I think it's a very good way of going that. He also did this whole thing where he talked about seeing God as a master and then seeing him as an employer, seeing him as a teacher, seeing him as a father. But ultimately, when you see Christ as your groom, that's sort of the ultimate, the intimacy that God invites us to by calling us the bride of Christ. And he thought that's where you want to get to the place of that kind of intimacy where you understand that you are the bride of Christ. As you look on page 28, one of his most famous things is his sermons on the Song of Solomon. Again, can you imagine 86 sermons on the Song of Solomon preached to a bunch of monks who'd pledged to celibacy? I mean, the picture's got to be pretty interesting. But anyway, those who listened to him soon called him Dr. Mellifluous because the words of his mouth were, anybody know what mellifluous? Honey flowing. Oh yeah, the honey man back there, he knows that. Honey flowing. They said his preaching was like honey flowing. Proverbs says, pleasant words are like a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. And apparently as he preached, his love just flowed out like honey. O Sacred Head Now Wounded, that's one of the aspects of one of his poems he wrote. Jesus, the very thought of thee is another hymn that's in our hymn book. Does anything revive your flagging powers, confirm your virtues, quicken your good habits, and foster you in purity of heart, as does that name? Jesus is honey to the lips, music to the ears, and gladness to the heart. So he had a love for Christ and intimacy with him. One of the mistakes of his life we're going to look at in just a little bit, he was the principal preacher and advocator of the Second Crusade. That one didn't go over so well. It failed miserably, and many people blamed him for that. His response was, I'd rather them be angry at me than angry at God, which I think is a pretty good response. Again, if you look at Bernard of Clairvaux's life, there's just a lot of paradoxes. He was a cloistered monk who had widespread public influence. He preached about God's immeasurable love for humanity, yet he promoted the Second Crusade, which many people would say that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. He stressed the authority and inspiration of Scripture. The reformers are going to draw a lot from his understanding of the importance of Scripture, yet he accepted the doctrine of purgatory. He exalted God above all else, yet was also known for his highly exalted view of Mary. His life is a reminder that we must be careful of judging medieval Christians based on our own 21st century context. He was a man influenced by his times just as we are influenced by our own. He was a man with weaknesses just as we are today. And again, if the Lord tarries 1,000 years from now, if people are going to evaluate our doctrine and our theology, there's probably going to be some stuff they're going to say, wow, I can't believe they believe that stuff. Anyway, I think some of the questions he would ask us, regardless of how you would interpret everything in his life, I think you would probably have to ask this question. In the flurry of your activity, when do you find time to commune with God? Do you love God because of what you can get or because of who he is? And what have you sacrificed lately in order to love God more? If we say we love God, is there anything that we've put on the altar because we recognize it's hindering our love in order to pursue him? If he is truly the satisfaction of our souls, then why are we hindered in pursuing him with the utmost of our being? My utmost for his highest is a good reminder, Oswald Chambers, of that passionate devotion to know God, to know Christ, and the fellowship of his sufferings and the power of his resurrection. And I have to say, in my own life, living in a distracted world, there are many things that vie for my love and my attention. And Bernard, I think, would challenge us to pursue Christ. That's where our satisfaction is going to be found. Like Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus. So, good challenge, Bernard of Clairvaux. He's one of my favorites in church history. Now let's go over to the Crusades. Woohoo! Well, I don't know if I should do that. That could probably get me in trouble. But anyway, what are the Crusades all about, and how do we interpret them? Interestingly, you can't read that, can you? If you remember, Pope John Paul II, one of the last things he did before he passed away was to issue an apology for the sins of the church during the Crusades. And if you remember, there was a time where, it may have been back in about 1995, I can't remember when it was, where there was even groups of people that were retracing the steps, and everywhere they went, they were asking for forgiveness for the Crusades. I don't quite know how to interpret that. I think it's probably good to acknowledge some of the things, particularly what the Crusaders did towards the Jews is probably the most indefensible thing, as they had this crusading spirit. But I think it's good to understand the background to the Crusades. It's just too easy to say, well, it was all bad. I draw a lot from Jonathan Riley Smith. If you're interested in reading, he wrote The Crusades, and this one's called A Short History. Jonathan Riley Smith is considered the foremost authority on the Crusades. He taught at Cambridge University, I think at Cambridge or Oxford, I can't remember. But this is a good book that just, I think, is a very balanced treatment that helps you understand what was going on with the Crusades. They're the dominant historical backdrop from 1000 to 1300. Sometimes they're presented as a bunch of fanatical Christians, indiscriminately and inhumanely slaughtering Muslims and Jews. I think this simplifies and exaggerates them. There were questionable things done by real Christians and professed Christians. That cannot be denied or excused, but there's more to the story than the simple surface level viewpoint that is often presented. What's going on? Well, remember back when we looked at Islam and the advance of Islam from 600 to 800, what was predominantly the Roman Empire and predominantly Christian was pretty much overrun over a 200-year period. And they were not stopped until here, the Battle of Tours, 732. And if they were not stopped there, our history would be totally different. They would have overrun the entire Europe and the empire, the Western Empire. And so they were stopped there by Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, and of course his grandson is Charlemagne, Charles the Great. Again, this is how they spread. That's sort of over time how the Islam spread. And what is important to understand with the Crusades is by the time of about 1085, they had pushed the Islamic line all the way to the place of Nicaea, which is about 100 miles from Constantinople, where the capital of the Eastern Empire was. So the Crusades began because the emperor of the eastern side sent a delegation to the western side and said, please send help because they're 100 miles from Constantinople and they're about to overrun us. And so as you look back at the Crusades, however you want to interpret them, they looked at them as defensive because Islam was continuing to spread and to pinch the empire from both the east and the western side. I can't remember what year it was when Spain finally pushed them back into North Africa. Otherwise, Spain for many years was dominated by Muslims. And so they looked at the Crusades as defensive, and they were invited by the emperor of the eastern side. What were the purposes of the Crusades? By the way, the Crusades emerged out of what's called the reforming spirit. We're looking at Bernard of Clairvaux. The papacy had gone into decadence. The church was corrupt. And really in the monasteries, there was this desire for reform. Two things they tried to eliminate was simony, the selling of church positions, and they tried to emphasize clerical celibacy. And those two went together because the thought was if priests are celibate, they can't pass on their land holdings and their position to their children. And so it sort of prevented that. And so there was an idea of reformation behind that. What were the purposes of the Crusades? Rescue the Byzantine Empire, the eastern side of the empire, which survived and was continuing on. They were being threatened by Islamic invasion. They asked for help. The second was to regain the Holy Land. Of course, there's going to be a desire to regain Jerusalem and all the Holy Land sites which were under Muslim control at that time. The third reason was to reunite the church. Remember, 1054, the church split. 1095, the Crusades began. The thought was if we go and rescue the Byzantine Empire, that may be the precursor to bringing things back together and reuniting the church and reuniting the eastern and western sides. That was a huge deal. And finally, to receive God's forgiveness. And this is where it gets a little questionable. But their desire was, as they went off on this crusade, they were egged on by Pope Urban II. You can see at the bottom of page 30. Here's his speech. He gets together in France. He's got all his audience there. He knows that the desire is to go rescue the Byzantine Empire. I think in the back of his mind, he thought, nobody's going to sign up for this. This has nothing that can be good about it. In fact, one of the things that Riley Smith brings up is, whatever you want to say about the Crusaders, they were not motivated by materialism. Most of the Crusaders lost everything they had. And there's records back then. They sold everything they had to fund them going. So they were not going because they were looking for riches. In fact, they basically lost everything. And so what they went for was because there was this desire, this reforming spirit, and most of it, for many of them, was this was a way they could show their devotion to God. They weren't going to join a monastery, but they could go fight for God, and that was huge for them. So Pope Urban II is giving this speech. He's trying to get people motivated to go. He says, I say it to those who are present. I command that to be said to those who are absent. Christ commands it. All who go thither and lose their lives, be it on the road or on the sea or in the fight against the pagans, will be granted immediate forgiveness for their sins. This I grant to all who will march by virtue of the great gift which God has given me. And to his surprise, a revival broke out, and thousands of them said, we'll go, we'll go, we'll go. God wills it, God wills it. And so thousands signed up to go and apparently sewed the cross on their clothes, and it was a sign of their commitment to go to the crusade. And so this is really what's called the earliest record of a plenary indulgence. And we're going to see indulgences next week. Indulgences are still used. In fact, I pulled up the CatholicNetwork.com. There's a plenary indulgence. There was a decree of indulgence for Divine Mercy Sunday, which granted a plenary or full indulgence to those who satisfied certain conditions established by the church. A plenary indulgence means that by the merits of Jesus Christ, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and all the saints, the full remission of the temporal punishment due to sacramentally forgiven sins is obtained. The person becomes as if just baptized and would fly immediately to heaven if he died in that instant. Now, I'm not an expert on Catholic theology. Larry Miller probably is a lot better than I am, and you could ask him some questions. But let me try to explain quickly what a plenary indulgence is, as my understanding. Because, again, this is going to come up again next week when we look at Luther. I was a youth pastor in New Orleans in the 90s, and I had several kids in my youth group who went to Catholic schools. And one day, one of the kids came up to me and said, we need a speaker on our Catholic junior high retreat. And I asked my teacher if you could be the speaker, and she said yes. So I said, okay. So I'm a 25-year-old who's given an invitation to be the retreat speaker at a Catholic school junior high retreat. I guess I was a little bold because when I went, my first message, I used the bridge illustration, which had led me to Christ. And so I drew, if you remember the bridge illustration, I don't know if you can see this or not. There's two cliffs. I'm on this side, and God's on this side. And sin separates us. And I need a bridge because I can't jump. It's like the Grand Canyon. And so what is the bridge to life? Well, it's the cross of Jesus Christ. Oh, boy. I got it really. You can see how good of a drawer I am. Wow, that's terrible. Anyway, that's as good of a cross as I can draw. I shared my testimony. I figured that's a good place to start. They can get to know me. I shared my life. I shared how my brother led me to Christ and used a bridge illustration that I understood that sin separated me from a holy and righteous God. There was nothing I could do to earn that salvation. All my works were like filthy rags. But God demonstrated his love in that his son Jesus Christ came and died. And if I trust in Jesus Christ, then through faith I have relationship to God. When I got done, the teacher, who I think was in training to be a deacon or something of that nature, I don't think he was going to be a priest, but he thanked me. It didn't kick me off the retreat. I guess that was probably good. He thanked me, and it was a good retreat overall. I got to know some of them and interact. And he thanked me and basically told the students there that I'd given an understanding of salvation that was more of a Protestant version of that. He did something I'll never forget. He took my same illustration, and this is what he said. He said that Christ's death gets us on the bridge, does not take us across the bridge. Christ's death opens the gate to the bridge. And then, through the church and sacraments, I begin to make my way across. And that was his explanation to them. That's why we do the sacraments, because God then infuses more and more grace. And if we don't make it across, what happens? Yeah, to make up the difference, we go to purgatory, where we are purified. We don't quite know how long that is. But if we don't make it all the way across the bridge, then we go to purgatory, where we're purified before we finally can have relationship with God. What is understood from a plenary indulgence was, see, this might be me, and I only get this far. How far do you think St. Francis of Assisi got? He not only made it across the bridge, he got this far in his righteousness. Well, this was extra credit. He didn't need to do that. Where does that extra credit go? No, it goes into the treasury of merit. For those who have lived incredibly good lives, righteous, the saints, Virgin Mary, they have exceeded that bridge, that gulf, and their good works go into the treasury of merit, which the Pope has been given responsibility to distribute as he wants. And therefore, he can say, Pope Urban II could say, anyone that goes on this crusade, what would be expected here with purgatory if he goes on this crusade with power given to me by St. Peter? I will give out of that treasury of merit the ability for him to have a plenary indulgence, immediate forgiveness. He becomes just like he's been baptized, totally free from sin. So if he were to die on this mission, where would he go? Straight to God, no purgatory involved. Now again, I have taught this class in many occasions where I've had people from Catholic backgrounds and Catholics. I have taught church history in a retreat setting where there was a mix of denominations, and that's a lot of fun. So far, I think I've got a good understanding of how plenary indulgences work, and that has been affirmed by other people. It is hard, even if you read Catholic doctrine, sometimes it's hard to understand, but this treasury of merit is what enables plenary indulgences to be given to enable someone to get out of purgatory. I don't say that in any derogatory way, except to say you cannot eliminate the differences between Protestants and Catholics. And if that is the Catholic doctrine and someone holds to that, then they are adding works to salvation, which is declaring that Christ's death is not sufficient. And if you add works to Christ's death, then it says you're really not depending on Christ's death for your salvation. You're really depending on your works. And that is going to be the issue that causes the Reformation, because it's indulgences that causes Luther to nail his 95 Theses on the door of Wittenberg. And he's basically saying if the Pope has access to this treasury of merit, he should be giving it out free. He shouldn't be requiring things and people giving money. It should be just given out of the goodness of his heart. But Luther understood that the just shall live by faith. It is totally the death of Christ that is totally sufficient. He died once for all. You do not add to it. And I know there's been some movements in Catholic theology. I don't know how much of that is terminology and how much of that is semantics, but at the heart of it is that salvation is by faith alone. And that is something that we cannot compromise on. It's at the very heart of the gospel. And Galatians says if you preach another gospel, anathema. And so, again, I want to be very careful. I'm not saying anything beyond what Scripture says and my understanding of what Urban II was issuing and what's going to be going on in the Reformation. Does that make sense? How do you balance it? Well, it's interesting. They used to be able to say, if you do this, it takes off 300 years. If you do this, it takes off 20 years. And they actually had a whole accounting system. If you read current Catholic theology, they no longer do that because they say no one knows. You just sort of have to say there's something taken off. But
so
you have to go on faith. Yeah, yeah. And again, I'm trying to be careful to say there are those in the Catholic Church who don't even understand this, and they have a full trust in Jesus Christ for their salvation. I'm just saying that doctrinally, this is what was going on at this period of time. This was going on during the Reformation, and I think many of it is still true today. And when you add works to the death of Christ, you basically have changed the gospel and made it not a gospel. Because how do you ever know if you've done enough? And this only produces pride, which is the opposite of what Ephesians 2:8 and 9 says. So anyway, I felt like I wanted to give you that because next week it's going to come into play. So why are they going on these crusades? Because for the first time, they can have in their minds assurance to be absent from the body, to be present with the Lord. Unfortunately, they're basing it on something that is not the true gospel. But I like what Jonathan Riley Smith says. The Crusaders regarded themselves as pilgrims, and while on crusade, they engaged in devotional and liturgical exercises characteristic of pilgrims. Now, laymen were given something to do that was almost equivalent to monasticism. If I'm a farmer and I'm married, I can't join a monastery. So how can I be sure that I'm going to be right with God? Well, in their minds, I'm going to go on a crusade, and if I die, the Pope's told me I'm going to have immediate entrance into heaven, which is not too far from Islamic doctrine, which says if I die in jihad, I go to heaven, which is, again, very much a works-based salvation. Did everyone in the crusade think that? No, but it was certainly something that motivated it. More than 50,000 people set out on the first crusade, and this is a ragtag bunch. One of their leaders is Peter the Hermit. He gets all of his people killed because he was just not a military leader and just was assuming that God, because he was Peter the Hermit, would give him victory. And I think most of his people were killed, and he happened to escape. The trip was approximately 2,000 miles. Give you context, that would be like walking from Baton Rouge to San Francisco, California. Could you imagine if we said, hey, let's go to San Francisco and go on a crusade, and we're all going to start walking or riding horses? You can imagine what that was like. If 50,000 people set out, they were like a swarm of locusts because wherever they came, they just devoured the food that was there. They did not have provisions. It was not like there was an organized thing. It was as organized as it could be. Along the way, they were so fiery and had so much zeal without knowledge, they thought, hey, if we're going to go fight the Muslims, let's fight the Jews along the way because they were responsible for the crucifixion of Christ. And again, that's where terrible theology and a terrible understanding of what Christ has called us to led to the atrocities that are associated with the Crusades. Again, not everyone did that, but unfortunately it did happen. Around 43,000 make it to Nicaea. They put a siege on the city and eventually are able to destroy it or conquer it. Then they march to Antioch. The opposition's stronger. They're about to get discouraged. Someone has a vision, and they find the holy lance that pierced Jesus' side. Apparently, Peter Bartholomew was the guy's name. He had a vision that the holy lance was buried in this church in Antioch. So they quickly dug it up looking for this lance. They couldn't find it. Peter Bartholomew says, let me go look, and he jumps in the hole, and he comes out with a spear and says, this is the spear that pierced Christ's side, and everyone gets excited, and that motivates them to continue to press on. A lot of this happened many times. Many people doubted it was the spear later on, and Peter Bartholomew said, well, test me by fire, and so they made a tunnel of fire out of palm branches, and he walked through it, and he survived, and people said, oh, he must be telling the truth. Of course, 8 days later, he died from his burns. So again, just to give you the fervency and the mindset of many of the Crusaders, they finally get to Jerusalem. There's only 15,000 left, so they've been reduced to about a third. They're hungry, they're weak, they're discouraged. Again, it's fiery preaching that gets them going. Someone tells them that God's not going to honor them unless they march around the city barefoot, sort of like a Joshua thing. They do. Eventually, they decide to attack. One wall is breached, and once they get inside, they say the blood rose to people's ankles because the rule was if you go into a house, it's yours. And if you destroy the people who are in the house is yours and everything that's in it. And here are people who've been traveling for years and are tired, they're hungry, and they finally get to the place where they have the opportunity to gain something, and they go, there's a bloodbath, basically. It says for months the stench in the city is unreal. So that's what happens when they killed Jews, they killed Muslims, they killed whoever was in the city. After a 350-year Muslim occupation, Jerusalem and all of Palestine is once again under Christian rule. So if you look at modern-day map, here's Turkey, here's Istanbul, Constantinople. They had gotten to Nicaea, Islam, and they pushed them all the way back and eventually were able to conquer this area. They restored some of the borders for the Eastern Empire, and what they conquered here in Israel and Syria, they claimed for the western side. So it sort of became the Latin Empire over in the Holy Land. There's waves of crusades. And here's all the crusades that take place. There's different numbers, how many, depending on how you want to count them. If you look on page 32, here's a list of 8 bigger ones. The first one succeeds. They capture Nicaea, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Eventually, the Muslims become more organized. The only reason they succeeded was because they were pretty much disorganized. They got more organized, and they began to reclaim some of the land. That's when Bernard of Clairvaux issues the Second Crusade. This one fails. The Third Crusade is what's called the King's Crusade. You heard of Richard the Lionhearted going off to fight the Crusade, and his brother John, and all that took place there. Well, that was the Third Crusade. Again, somewhat successful, but not really. They recaptured Acre and Jaffa and negotiated access to Jerusalem. If you go to Israel, by the way, you can actually go to a fort. I remember going to it that was built by the Crusaders. Can't remember what city that's in, but anybody know what city that's in? Akko? Acre? Okay. And so he negotiated access, and so that's the story of Richard Lionhearted. The Fourth Crusade, they were supposed to go and try to reclaim Egypt, and along the way they said, you know what, why don't we stop in Constantinople because we're running out of money, and they stop in Constantinople and they go ahead and destroy Constantinople. So, one of the goals was to reunite the empires. Well, they basically pretty much ended that when the Fourth Crusade took a detour and actually destroyed Constantinople. They destroyed the Eastern Empire and that city, or sacked it in order to get money for their trip, and then they end up not going on the crusade. Fifth one was not successful. Sixth one was not successful. Seventh and eighth were led by St. Louis. You ever heard of St. Louis? He's the only king of France who's declared a saint, St. Louis IX. He tried to recapture Egypt, got dysentery on both of them. The first time he survived, though they said he had to stay in the rear guard, and he actually cut a hole in the back of his pants so he could fight the battle. That's how bad the dysentery was. The second time he went, he got captured on that one. They had to pay a large ransom to release him. He went again on the eighth one, and this time he died. There's other crusades like the Children's Crusade, which are just sad. Apparently a young boy named Stephen, who was 12 years old, had a vision that the reason the Crusades were not succeeding is because the people were not pure enough, and that only a child would be able to trust God enough to defeat the Muslims. And he had a vision that when they got to the ocean was going to part like it did for Moses, and all of them would just walk to the Holy Land. He obviously had no idea how far that was, but anyway, apparently they got to the coastline. Of course, the water did not part, but some ships showed up and said, "We'll take you." And he said, okay, maybe I misinterpreted the vision. It wasn't that the water was going to part, but that these ships were going to show up to take us. Well, they know that those ships were part of the Muslims, and they took them and sold them into slavery. And so that's what happened to all the kids that followed him. The results of the Crusades. Well, hatred grew between the East and the West and with Jews and Muslims. So what they said was going to possibly unite the East and West actually created more enmity, and also create enmity with the Jews and with Muslims. The Pope gained more power because he begins to, if he has that kind of power to declare a plenary indulgence, he started to gain more power, or at least thought he had more power. Relics were brought from the Holy Land. This is when things start getting weird. Everywhere they went in the Holy Land, they find a tooth or a bone or a spear. Everything is tied to something in the Bible, and it's brought back, and people begin to venerate these relics. In fact, sometimes whole churches are built around some relic that was found in the Holy Land. Heresy begins to be dealt with in the spirit of the Crusades. When the Crusades fail, that same mindset now is turned towards heresy. And now you're going to get the Inquisition and some of the other stuff. Hey, if we're going to go fight heretics out there and destroy them and we don't succeed, well, let's fight the heretics that are right here in our own territory. And that's when they start killing fellow believers or believers who dared to disagree with some of the doctrines of the church. And finally, wealth is brought from the East, particularly after the Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade brought a lot of wealth back, and so there are some trade that begins to open up and some wealth that takes place. Positive side, it may have preserved Europe, and there was great advances in nursing and medicine. How do you view it? Again, I think unfortunately when the church and state are united, whatever the state does, it falls on the church. And then, of course, in this case, the Pope is the one that primarily started this, and so obviously it creates a dark stain on the history of the church. But you can say that at that point, though the church-state being melded together is not a good situation, that was the only thing they could do to stop what could have been Islam totally destroying the eastern side of the empire and eventually probably the western side. I do say it's zeal without knowledge and investing religious leadership with political power are dangerous things. Did you get all that? That's, again, a difficult part of church history, but that is part of the Crusades. And again, I think a balanced view, if you want to look at Jonathan Riley Smith's book, I think it'll be helpful. Let me cover Francis of Assisi, and or at least get started with that, and then we can take a break and look at, finish off with Wycliffe. This is going to be even more fun. Francis of Assisi. I don't know how to say Assisi. Is Assisi? Anybody from France? Or no, this is actually in Italy. Huh? I want to say St. Francis of Assisi, but that sort of, like I said, makes a comment about his dad. I don't want to do that. Assisi. Let me say that I remember teaching, again, church history. I was able to teach in a mixed environment one time at a retreat setting in New York. And let me say, critiquing St. Francis arouses a lot of controversy. I was basically talked down by someone who thought there is no way I could ever critique St. Francis. He, for many, particularly in Catholic circles, is considered, I mean, you have Christ here, you have St. Francis here. And that he is, it'd be like me trying to critique Mother Teresa in a mixed setting. I mean, it'd be like, how can you even touch her because you don't even measure up, so how could you ever say anything? But unfortunately, if you look at his life, you have to at least ask some questions. And that's all I want to do as we look at his life, because he's an example of medieval spirituality. And here's what I say. His life is either a testimony of extreme sacrifice to the Lord or a sad account of legalistic, ascetic religion gone too far. And I'm only going to say, God only knows. He either sacrificed everything for Christ, and it's just incredible, or he was trying to earn his salvation, and it's sort of sad that that's the extremes he had to go to. Let's just talk about his life, and I'll let you sort of make the final call here. His childhood, he's born in 1181, the Italian hill town of Assisi. He's born, his name Giovanni. Because Assisi, by the way, is here in Italy. But his dad, Pietro, was a wealthy cloth merchant who went to France a lot. His wife was from France. He loved France. While he was gone on a trip, his wife gave birth to Giovanni, and when he came back, he said, you know what, I love France so much, I want to name him Francisco, or Francis, which means little Frenchman. And so I don't know if his name was officially changed, but the reason he's called France is because he's known as a little Frenchman because his dad had such a love for France. Pietro was a very successful cloth merchant. He had hopes for Francis to take over his business. He was a very wealthy man in that time period. In fact, one biographer said of Francis, he squandered his time terribly and outshone his friends in trivialities, various evils, and was eager for foolishness of every kind. I.e., he was a spoiled rich kid. I mean, he just had everything given to him. In that culture, that was an unusual ability to live in that kind of wealth, and he was a very spoiled child that apparently pursued all kinds of trivial things. His life took an unexpected turn in 1202. He's 21 years old. He joins the army in a battle against another fellow city-state. In the midst of the battle, he is captured, and he's imprisoned for a year before his father was able to pay a large ransom for his release. After returning home, it took him a year to recover physically and mentally from his ordeal. We don't know what happened, but back then they did not have the Geneva rules of engagement. And being caught as a prisoner, he probably was tortured or abused in some way. And when he got back after a year of that, mentally he was a changed person. And it began to impact him. And so after a year of finally recovering, he leaves his home and basically takes up a life of solitude. He just sort of goes out into the woods and starts living by himself. He senses the Lord telling him to rebuild the church, and he finds an old abandoned church, and he begins to rebuild it. He takes that literally and begins to rebuild it. He also begins to take all the possessions he has, his dad's stuff, and he starts giving his dad's stuff away. Apparently his dad sent him on a trip to the market with a bunch of expensive cloth and sent him there to sell it. When he came back, he had nothing. In fact, he was walking back. His dad sent him on a horse, and when he came back, he didn't have the horse. And he asked him what he did, and he said, I gave it all away. So he gave away all his dad's merchandise and then gave away his horse on top of that. His dad said, my son has lost his mind. And so he got so angry that I left a little blank there to build that suspense. He threw him in the family dungeon. I guess every family had their own dungeon. That's pretty cool. In fact, that might be something to consider in parenting. I don't know. Threw him in the family dungeon to try to keep him from just giving away all of his stuff. Apparently, his mom let him out later on. Always mom leaves him out, you know. I remember that as a kid. You know, I had to sit there at the dinner table until I ate my food. And then when my dad left, my mom said, okay, you're done. Go away. That's sort of, I guess things haven't changed in 1,000 or 800 years. Anyway, in a last effort to stop his son from giving away all his stuff, he actually hauls him before the bishop, and he says, my son has given away thousands and thousands of dollars of my stuff, and I demand compensation. He won't listen to me. Maybe you can talk some sense into him. I want my stuff back, or I want you to somehow change my son from this incredibly unbridled generosity. Francis, thinking his dad, if he wants all his stuff, well, Francis stripped down naked and gave him all of his clothes and said, I now renounce you as my father. Now I only say, my Father who art in heaven. And there's actually a painting. I don't know if you can see it or not. I guess after he stripped down, the bishop who was there was a little embarrassed and wrapped him in a cloak. And eventually they found an old farmer's smock to give him. He put that on and apparently wore that the rest of his life. So he renounced any ties to his dad and had no further contact with him the rest of his life. His calling, how about I get to this and then we'll pause. His calling, he was at Mass in the Church of St. Mary of the Angels when he heard the words of Matthew 10, 9 through 10, proclaimed during the sermon. Do not take along any gold or silver or copper in your belts. Take no bag for the journey, or extra tunic, or sandals, or a staff, for the worker is worth his wages, or worth his keep. He takes that as a message to him, and he felt the Lord had called him to a life of absolute poverty, wandering through the villages, preaching the gospel. He desired to live as Christ lived among the poor. Soon he attracted a group of followers who joined him in his poverty. They became, I think it's called a mendicant order, which basically is a begging order. They don't want to have any money, like this says, but only get their sustenance through begging and through people giving them what they need. If you read, and again, I haven't read extensively on Francis, so if you've read something different, that would be helpful to me. But what I've read, I put gospel in quotation marks because he would say the gospel is basically giving up everything to follow Jesus. And he really put the emphasis on poverty being the way of salvation. So much so that later when Thomas Aquinas is going to write that love is the heart of the gospel and is the ultimate measure of following Christ, for a while Thomas Aquinas' books are going to be banned among Franciscans because they disagree. And they say poverty is the heart of what it means to follow Christ. And only the poor really are those who can be assured, I guess, of salvation. So poverty became his way of life. Their ascetic devotion often went to extremes. By the way, they did become an official order. Today, I think they're the largest religious order in the Catholic Church. That's why critiquing him is sometimes a very dangerous thing to do. 3 examples, and then we'll take a break. Sleeping on a stone. How do you think St. Francis slept? He refused to have any comforts. And so he would not sleep with blankets. He would basically sleep on the ground. And sometimes he would even sit up, not to even give himself the comfort of laying down. He would sit up. If he did lay down, the only thing he could use for a pillow was a rock. That was his idea of saying that I don't want any comforts in life. Eat less chicken. That's sort of my opposite version of Chick-fil-A. Apparently, at one point, and these are stories that I'm drawing a lot from Christian History magazine. Apparently, at one point, he tasted chicken and ate some chicken. He was not a strict vegetarian. He ate some chicken and really enjoyed it. Later, he felt really guilty that he enjoyed it, and so he asked one of his fellow brothers to tie a rope around him and drag him through the streets and proclaim, "Behold the glutton, behold the glutton, behold the glutton." Money and manure, he did not like money. He didn't want you to touch money, deal with money. Apparently, he had other people outside the order that could deal with money if people gave it. He didn't want any of his brothers to touch money. Apparently, one of them did. And when he found out about it, he had the brother, take the coin, stick it in his mouth, crawl out to a pile of dung, and put the coin in the dung so that he would always remember that's how we should view money, that it is no better than donkey dung, as it said. And so that was his attitude towards money. It was not the love of money that was evil. It was money itself. There's another example they give in here where they say that he rejected the favor of men, and he would see to it that he would be rebuked by somebody. If he was ever honored for something, he would call some brother to him, saying to him, "In obedience, I say to you, revile me harshly, and speak the truth against the lies of these others." And when that brother, though unwilling, would say that Francis was a bore, a hired servant, a worthless being, Francis, smiling and applauding very much, would reply, "May the Lord bless you, for you have spoken most truly. It is becoming that the son of Peter, of Bernardone or Pietro, should hear such things." And so he was not one who would say love of self for God's sake. He was one that would say you always look at yourself as a worthless being. On the other side, in an age of total corruption, in an age of total luxury where the church had been totally corrupt, yeah, maybe he swung the pendulum way too far to the other side, but he lived a life that was very different. And you can't deny that he did some things that are pretty convicting. Leprosy was around back then, and instead of being repulsed by lepers, he often hugged them and kissed them and ministered to him. And many people, in fact, if you see a lot of pictures of St. Francis, you'll see him like that. In fact, if you see a statue in someone's yard, there's usually got animals there because he had a love for God's creation and for animals, and apparently he would even preach sermons to the animals. And the legends were that animals always gathered around him and listened to him, and when he would dismiss them, they would go. And so there's that picture of him as this great lover of creation and of animals and a lover of people, particularly the outcasts and the poor. So what do you do with all that? Yes, Bob. No. Okay. That'd be interesting to see. Is that pretty accurate? No. I haven't seen it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I didn't see it. Again, we haven't finished with him. We'll finish him after the break. But again, just as a way of saying, this is where it gets a little weird. And you sometimes don't know, is this motivated out of love of Christ, or is this motivated in a way of trying to earn salvation? And if you're trying to earn salvation, you're going to find with Martin Luther, if you're going to try to earn it, wow, you're going to have a struggle, because to try to meet the righteousness of Christ on your own is going to demand something that, if you're honest with the condition of your heart, you're going to be like Martin Luther in confession 24 hours a day. And to come to the place where you finally understand the just shall live by faith is a freeing thing. As Martin Luther said, it felt like the dungeon doors were opened and my soul sprang out to freedom. By the same token, there are things that he speaks that are convicting to an age where materialism and consumerism are very much what we're used to. And so there is that challenge as well. So I'm trying to be as fair as I can in that regard. But let's pray. Father, thank you for your grace. And Father, I do say thank you for your grace. And we don't know the hearts of those in the past, but help us to learn and to evaluate and critique, to be challenged by things that we can be challenged by, and to be thankful that we're not in a situation where we feel like we have to earn our salvation, but we know that's a free gift offered by your grace. So, Father, give us wisdom as we continue to go through church history, and help us to, again, be thankful for the legacy passed on to us, but also honest with the reality that everyone we see has got clay feet, and a reminder that we are always in need of your grace and your strength. Thank you for Jesus. We pray these things in his name. Amen. Why don't we take a 10